good morning. Tom, this is Tom Powell. And on behalf of the Dundee University Review of the Arts and the Dundee Literary Festival, welcome to the interview room. Now, today we're going to be talking a little bit about both of your latest collections. And I was wondering if first you could tell us a little bit about concerning the Atlas of Scotland.
Well, concerning the Atlas of Scotland was the result of it was actually a 3-month residency at the National Library of Scotland as the Bartholomew's writer in residence. They have there was an artist in resident and a writer in resident, and so it's based in the mapping department for 3 months, and had access to the collections and help from experts there, and that's really why I was able to produce a book in really, a very short time. Although obviously it was the 3 months was the intensive part, but there was times before and after working on it.
And so John Bartholomew, in the collection, you sort of interact with his diaries a bit. Who was he?
John Bartholomew is one of the Bartholomew, it's the Bartholomew family of map makers, and John Bartholomew was one of particular interest. He'd really advanced the map making within the firm, and he was also a particular favourite of Carla Baker, who was the Bartholomew's archivist.
Oh, I see.
And it was really that's really an example of how the process worked, because Carla would interest me in somebody. In fact, if I may, she would interest me in an aspect of Bartholomew's work, or I would seek advice in something I was interested in, and then I sort of took up her passion and asked more about him. And like I say, they had this diary that he'd written, which was a cross between a personal diary and a work diary, and it spanned the time from when he was small, going right up until his son died in the First World War, and then it ran out. I don't know if you can see John Bartholomew, and you can see it's a very striking photograph.
He's really remarkable looking.
Yeah. Sorry.
And quite a sad story in some ways. That poem ends on quite a kind of
yes.
sad note.
Yeah, and he also, he worked very hard, and through quite a lot of illness, John Bartholomew as well.
Yeah, and so if Carla was kind of bringing things to you, and I think that's a really good idea, because I've been in the maps department and it's overwhelmingly vast, isn't it?
Yeah.
But do you have
2 million maps?
Yeah, 2 million maps. A mere 2 million
maps.
Do you have a favourite that you encountered in your work?
Well, we were very lucky to begin with Chris Fleet, who's the senior map archivist. Laid out, when we first arrived, on one of these huge map tables, he laid out maps that would be of interest to us. And one of these was the Blau Atlas, which is the cover of this book, which is 17th century Atlas of Scotland, and very beautiful to be able to turn the pages and to look at that. And the other one was, another one that was of interest, was which is on the back of the book, was a 1983 Soviet map of Edinburgh.
Yeah, I wondered what that was. How did that come about? The
Soviets in the Cold War had 40,000 people working in their mapping department, and their maps were more up to date than Ordnance Survey maps.
That's incredible.
They would, and in fact, every Russian embassy had somebody attached who was responsible for for mapping, and quite often they would arrange sort of fake picnics near installations that were of interest to them and engage locals in conversation. And the map of Edinburgh, it had, well, like all their maps, it had the important buildings were colour-coded, road widths were given, road surfaces, heights of bridges, and it was said that they could guide a tank to your front door. They knew which way to go. And yet what was of interest to me was I grew up in Edinburgh and I couldn't find my way around this map at all because of the Cyrillic alphabet. It just kept on, spouting off the surface of it. And I had to use an ordinary map to find Princess Street in both of them and then kind of plot my way back to the house where I grew up.
Well, I wanted to ask about that actually, because maps are we think they're such a visual, universally accessible thing that is not at all reliant on language. But obviously the Cyrillic is very kind of a barrier. And I sort of wanted to ask about the way in which, accessing maps through poems, if that's a kind of good guide in a funny way. What's the experience of writing about maps?
Well, I think all maps are metaphors, aren't they? Because they can't represent, you cannot represent accurately, every blade of grass. So you need to be selective. And, obviously, place names are very evocative.
Yeah.
And I think maps also are evocative because they kind of encode memory.
Yes.
My line is that, maps, they kind of they predict experience and they encode memory. So if you're looking at a holiday map, you're looking at the places that you've been and the places that you're excited to go. And after you've been, these places become memories to you. So they're very evocative. And I think the other thing with maps, because they're metaphors, is not everything gets onto a map.
Yes.
And there was an academic that I got very interested in, a man J.R. Harley, and I read an essay about him that was, just at the start of the project that a friend recommended that became very influential for me. He talked about utterances and silences. That maps there's a rhetorical aspect to a map. And an utterance is anything that gets on the map, and a silence is everything that doesn't get on the map. So that, for example, if we look at the map round Dumfries on considering the Atlas of Scotland, the poem considering the Atlas of Scotland, the castle gets on. The castle's an utterance, castles, churches, buildings like that. They're utterances, but there's nothing about the people, ordinary people who live around about. They're silences, basically. So that whole idea of utterances and silences was of interest to me, and actually was an aspect that I found retrospectively with the A Wild Adventure, because of course the reason that one of the justifications that the invaders gave for taking over all of Australia was that it was terra nullius. There was nothing there.
Yes.
There was nothing there. It was so it was all silence.
Yes, exactly.
So nobody was doing anything with it, so it's ours.
And that brings us very neatly onto A Wild Adventure, which follows the story of Thomas Watling, sometime forger, an adventurer. Could you tell us a little bit about him?
Thomas Watling was born in 1762, I think, and he was charged with forging guinea notes, which in today's money is they were worth roughly £60, and he was charged with forging guinea notes, and he had the option of being transported or being hanged, and he chose the first option.
Yes, unsurprisingly, maybe.
Yeah, and he went to Australia, and he was transported to Australia, but on the ship going down, taking him from Edinburgh down to Plymouth, where the prison hulks were, from where you'd be loaded onto a ship transporting you to Australia. He and another guy, Peyton, foiled a mutiny. And they thought they would both get off because they'd foiled this mutiny. But in actual fact, sorry, I'm just going to kill my mobile phone.
No, that's fine. I had to do mine just before you came in.
Sorry, carry on until you. Sarah Maitland calls these instruments of the devil. I made far more fuss taking that off than I would have just if it had rung. Anyway, they foiled this mutiny thinking they would both get off. Peyton got off, Watling didn't. And Watling didn't get off because he was adjudged to be a valuable member of the new colony. And he was adjudged to be a valuable member because he could paint and he could illustrate. And the reason for that was that in the first fleet going out to Australia, there were 14 officers on board had publishers' contracts, and their work all needed illustrated. And so Watling was on the spot to paint everything they shot out of the sky and pulled out of the sea and plucked from the ground.
And it's a really interesting position because he very much documents all of the new kind of botanical and zoological discoveries, but under a degree of duress. So these beautiful things are being made, but not in a very happy way. How did you reconcile that in the collection?
Absolutely. He was made to paint these things in the way that other convicts were getting made to dig ditches.
Yeah.
But he had a pride as an artist. He had an idea of himself as a cut above, and in one of his painting, he would sign his paintings, T. Watling delineate. Thomas Watling did it, drew it, and the man who was in charge of him, Surgeon General John White, wrote a very testy letter sending off these illustrations, saying, on publication, the name of the artist may be left out. But Watling insisted, kept on putting his name in things. So there was a self-respect as an artist there, although he did describe himself as being used like a utensil, passed around and used like a utensil. And one of the things that's kind of remarkable about him, he wrote very disparagingly about the Australians. But when he drew them in a way that people could recognise who they were. So he would draw these portraits of men and women and then show them to people, and the people who knew them recognised them. And that sort of giving a local inhabitant their individuality, recognising their individuality, was very rare in colonies in the 18th century.
Absolutely.
People weren't doing that.
And in a funny way, what you have done as we talk about him removing his signature is really give him back a platform and a voice and a sense of individuality. He's much more than just a criminal who was shipped off. And one of the really interesting things about this book is that it contains sections of his letters. It contains actual text by him. How do you find that balances his words and your words in the same book?
I wanted to give something of him because, let's say, there is this sort of contrast between what he thought he was doing and what he was doing. You know, terribly disparaging. He was terribly disparaging about the people. He was terribly disparaging about the whole enterprise. You know, and that's where the title of the book comes from. He said something like, you know, I consider it just a wild adventure. You know, like worth nothing.
Yes.
Well, he showed he was pretty wrong there. So yes, so I wanted to give him something of his voice. Something we know so little about Thomas Watling, and the images are there. So I wanted to have the images. I wanted people to see that he was a considerable artist, and I wanted, you know, whatever of his voice was there, I wanted it to come through.
Yeah, absolutely, and it really does. And what's interesting about these collections, kind of in tandem, is that they are both, to an extent, about adventures, about journeying, about the places that life might take us. Do you have a particular kind of are poets drawn to journeys and exploring what journeys might mean?
Yeah, well, I think so. I think Tolstoy said something like all stories are either about somebody leaving a place to go on a journey, or somebody who's been on a journey arriving in a place. So, you know, I think there's obviously a metaphor, you know, clearly in journeying through time and through experience, and making sense of these experiences. And one of the things that interested me most, actually, about Thomas Watling is how do you make sense of such experiences as he's had? I mean, obviously there was no post-traumatic stress, but this is somebody who's been wrenched from his background, sent away across the world. I mean, lots of people opted to be hanged rather than to be transported, because, you know, why prolong the agony? And he saw pretty horrible things there, and worked his way back, and then he worked his way back to Dumfries, where he wasn't really able to make much of his life, as far as one can tell. So how do you make sense of that? How do you make that into a story that people can understand and sympathise with? People who've never been out their own backyard, really.
Well, that's really interesting, because one of the things that Douglas Dunn says on the back of the book is that it's a very complicated, risky venture to write a poetry book that's a single narrative arc rather than a collection of different bits. And obviously these two are quite different in that respect. How did you find writing a kind of long single narrative?
Well, I have to say, you know, when I say, you know, this was the result of a 3-month residency, it makes me sound like, you know, Speedy Gonzales, you know, but actually the Wild Adventure was 25 years.
Wow.
Really, it was 25 years that I was interested in him, and thinking that, you know, I'd like to write something about him. And at first I thought I would write a radio play, a monologue. I'd just written one about John Ray and the Franklin expedition. So I thought, well, maybe this would work. And then, you know, I thought, no, that wouldn't work. And then I decided on poems because through a kind of distrust of narrative. I was teaching a course in storytelling at the time at the university, and there's something once you get into storytelling, everything seems to come within story. It becomes this all-enveloping thing, and this it kind of fills up gaps, narrative, storytelling, and I wanted to be kind of a bit more honest than that, I felt. And so I thought what I would like to do is to go in and trust particular moments.
Yes.
Kind of existential moments, like, yes, I'm sure he must have felt that here, and I know he was here then, so I kind of go in. And that's how I started. I started off writing lots of these short poems, and then I laid them out on the floor. And then I put them into some kind of order. So of course you can't get away from narrative. You've got to make a narrative at some point. But often when I told people what I was doing, they'd say, "Oh, it sounds like a great novel."
Yes.
"Oh, it sounds like a great film." I said, "Well, that's not really what I'm doing," and that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to isolate moments and to somehow show in the book that I wasn't pretending what I didn't know.
Yes, absolutely.
Sometimes I myself am commenting on Watling. Sometimes Watling speaks for himself. Sometimes I feel he's like my eyes, seeing things wherever he is.
And as a sort of final question, because both of these books are sort of about, to some extent, journeying or maps, I was wondering, because you live fairly locally, if you have a favourite walk or favourite excursion around here that you enjoy.
Well, I live in Dumfries.
You live in Dumfries.
I live in Dumfries. Well, do you know, 3 or 4 years ago, I could have told you that there's a forest near Dumfries called Maybe Forest, and I've run round it so many times during all kinds of seasons: spring, summer, snow on the ground, trees falling over with wind, and I love that. I love that run, kind of 4 mile run that you can extend. But as one of the poems in the book shows, I went over my ankle about 3 years ago, and I haven't been able to do it. So,
what a shame.
So there we go.
What a shame. Yeah. Well, I hope that you make it maybe in the spring. There'll be a feeling that it's time.
Oh, well, boy, that would be very nice. That would be nice. Miracles.
Yeah, absolutely. Something nice for Christmas. Well, thank you very much indeed. It's been fascinating.
Thank you very much indeed for talking to me.